In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Thank you all for your patience in these extended gospel readings. I want to assure you that Mark and I do not choose the length of the readings. Those are chosen for us, so please don't blame us. Recently, I came across several articles regarding the efforts in Iraq to regain cities that were lost to ISIS. And for so long, the news about the fight against ISIS had been all about their power and their progress, and it has appeared hopeless. No one seemed to know how to fight these extremists who represented no country and operated with no moral code. Yet recently, there are indications that they are being driven out bit by bit, mile by mile. People are returning to some of the towns that ISIS had taken over. There was one article about a town called Bartella, which is not far from Mosul. Bartella is one of the oldest Christian towns in the world, and thousands were forced out after ISIS came in. It was over 2 years before the town was reclaimed by American and Iraqi soldiers. In this article I read, some of the displaced people said that they planned to return, but many were afraid to do so. Many were worried that there was nothing to return to, and they were afraid that ISIS would regain control, or if not them, some other extremist group. The people of Bartella were forced out of their homes for a little over 2 years, and that's a long time to be displaced, especially when you don't know if you'll ever return to your home or if there will be a home to return to. The people of Israel were exiled for over 50 years, more than a generation. And that 50 years is known as the Babylonian exile, and it's a defining moment in Jewish history. It was approximately 500 years before Jesus was born, just to put it in context. The book of Ezekiel begins with a prophet warning people of what was to come, which of course is Babylon coming in and taking over. There was a great deal of judgment and anger because he was trying to get them to change. But by the time we get to chapter 37, which is where our Old Testament reading for today comes from, Jerusalem had been destroyed, and most of the people were forced to leave their home and live in another land. Ezekiel was one of those displaced people. He was there with the others in Babylon, and while he was a little hard on them before the exile, his tone shifted after. They didn't need judgment anymore. What they needed was hope. You see, it wasn't just that they'd been defeated. It wasn't just that they'd been forced from their homes. It wasn't just that they'd seen so many people die. Any of those things would be enough to leave a person in despair. Yet, for the Hebrew people, it was that much worse because they were away from their spiritual home. For the Hebrew people, God was in the temple in Jerusalem. And that was where God lived. So what did it mean if the temple where God lived was destroyed? How could they worship God when they were no longer near him? They felt as though they were completely cut off from God. Even though they were no longer fighting a bloody war, even though they were not living in this valley of bones, they might as well have been. Their home was destroyed, their God had abandoned them, hope was buried under the rubble that was once their home. God knew what the people were feeling. He knew their grief. Thus, he gave Ezekiel a remarkable vision to share with these displaced people. In this vision, God brought Ezekiel to this valley of bones, and he showed him how to bring life to these bones. As you heard in the reading, the rubble of bones became people of flesh and blood and even breath and life. There was new life in the valley. After showing Ezekiel this, the Lord said to him, "Mortal, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, 'Our bones are dried up, our hope is lost, we are cut off completely. Now, in saying this, God told Ezekiel who these bones represented and what the vision was in response to. It was very clear. Now, the Psalms have all kinds of prayers of people who are living through the Babylonian exile. In these Psalms, the people were crying out and often referred to their bones. In many ways, references to bones, it's like a reference to our deepest self. We still use phrases like, I can feel it in my bones, or I'm bone tired. It's almost like referring to our core or our essence, much like it was in the time of Ezekiel. So when the people said, our bones are dried up and our hope is lost, God took this dreadful image of bones piled up and transformed it into an image of hope. God showed that these bones could have life. And it was a way, and is a way, to show that hope is not lost, not as long as you have the breath of God. Because that is what made the difference. Breath. Ezekiel said, I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived and stood on their feet, a vast multitude. It was the breath of God, the Spirit of God, that allowed them to live, that gave them the power to stand together. And it's important to note that they stood together. It was this whole community, the multitude. It had to be because it was the whole community who had been exiled. It was not enough for them to have hope. They all needed to be inspired. They all needed this breath of God. It was the only way that they would find the strength they needed. The people of Israel were exiled for a long time, but eventually they returned to their beloved city of Jerusalem. And much as they feared their city was in ruins, there was no temple. There were no homes to return to. Once again, they had to find a way to bring life to a place that seemed lifeless. And they had to do it together. The town of Bartella in Iraq was liberated in October of 2016. And that Christmas, about 200 people returned to the town to celebrate Christmas Eve in their church. For most, it was the first time they had returned home. And while it was uplifting to celebrate that holy day in their sacred place, their church, they were surrounded by rubble. The church had to be guarded by snipers so they could celebrate in relative safety. Many said it was nice to have this experience and good to be home, but they would not be returning because it was not safe. They could not take that risk. Yet one woman who was interviewed said, ISIS came to kill the soul, but they couldn't. They killed the body. We are back now. ISIS thought they could take the life from the town, from the people. They thought they had left only rubble and bones. But there was still life there. The breath of God remained with the people of God. And when the soldiers reclaimed the city, one of the first things they did was to ring the church bells. Both the people of Israel, people of Iraq, and people everywhere who have been forced to flee from their homes, they survive, if they survive at all, on hope. A hope that God will continue to breathe life into them, and a hope that when God does breathe this life into them, there will be a community to stand with them. After the Civil War, the St. John's community returned to find their homes and their church in rubble. Yet they found a way to rebuild, to survive so that we could worship here today. But they did not do it alone. They did it with the help of the people around the state and even the country. And that is what we are called to do as Christians, to help others rebuild, to be the breath of God for communities and people who have lost hope. And I'll be honest, I'm not exactly sure how to do that. Ezekiel had a wonderful vision that changed him and helped him inspire others. But he first had to be open to that vision and to act on that vision. And I suppose that's the first step for all of us, a willingness to envision our world transformed and to see ourselves as agents of that transformation. Amen.